So, welcome everyone. It's Health Economics. So, starting this chapter, we are going to focus on talking about the supply side of the healthcare markets. So, chapter 12, we are going to mainly focus discussions on the pharmaceutical company or the drugs market, basically. So in this chapter, we are going to talk about the specific nature of pharmaceutical industry and try to understand how they work in general, and also more specifically, we are going to talk about what are some of the uncertainty they face that allows them to earn the patents protections in the markets. And at the end of this chapter, we would like to talk about the innovations of the pharmaceutical industries, why is it important, and how regulations actually affects the pharmaceutical industry in general, and what kind of regulation we should actually design for this specific market. Well, to introduce pharmaceutical industry, we have to date back to the 18th centuries. So the first pharmaceutical company, actually, it's named Bayer. It's a Germany chemical company that introduced a painkiller called aspirin. So obviously, this is a very common use painkiller nowadays. I believe most of you guys may have heard it somewhere, or maybe you have used it on your own. Well, today, the pharmaceutical industry, it's really, really massive. So you can actually think about how many big company in today's days, they are basically drugs company. They produce drugs, new, and also specifically inventions of new drugs to earn a lot of money. But at the same time, they are very, very highly regulated, especially in the US markets. The pharmaceutical company, they are usually very, very strict regulated by the US government. So we'll talk about what kind of restrictions they are facing in order to have the product launched to the market. But even comparing to the rest of the world, I would say it's not easy for a pharmaceutical company nowadays to introduce their drugs to the markets in anywhere in the world. There are certain things happens in the history of the pharmaceutical industry that makes it very, very important for the government to regulate these markets. And of course, this industry, it's very ideal setting to study for both economic innovations and also economics of regulations, because this is one specific market that actually very, very unique by itself. So talk about the supply side of healthcare, or maybe drugs, pharmaceuticals industry. We can actually think about the relationship. Why is it so unique comparing to other markets, like buying televisions on the street in Best Buy, or maybe buying a Coca-Cola from your local supermarket store? How come healthcare services is so unique by itself? So we can actually think about the relationship between different agencies in the markets. So if you're going to study more of the healthcare market, you might find out that most of the time, the market does not only involve with consumers and sellers, because most of the product that we buy nowadays only involve with buyer and seller, which is the demander and the supplier. Well, sometimes we might see some government's action taken in specific market, but in general, there are not complicated for the government to regulate. But in the case of healthcare services, or maybe in specific case here that we study in this chapter, which is the pharmaceutical markets, well, the suppliers, the pharmaceutical company, and the insurance company, which is the third party in the markets, are usually very, very highly regulated by the government. So instead of having the government regulating the producers or maybe sometimes the buyers in the markets. Well, in the case of healthcare services, the government has to regulate both the insurance company and the product supplier, which is the pharmaceutical company in this chapter. On the other hand, well, the patients or maybe the buyer of the drugs, well, they have to deal with two parties at the same time most of the cases. Number one, they have to deal with the pharmaceutical company itself, so they have to purchase the drugs from the company, or maybe sometime the patients or the buyer of the drugs, they can actually go through the insurance plan, which is the insurance company that they have to deal with in order to get the drugs that they need. So now the buyer does not have only one channels to get the products. They now have actually two channels. And adding on top of that, the insurance company, because they are taking the money from the insurance buyer, they're offering this coverage where they have to sometimes deal with the pharmaceutical company by themselves. So from time to time, the insurance company may have to actually pay a huge payment to pharmaceutical company because, well, the insurance buyer that they sell the insurance package may have to request those drugs on their own. So in general, you can actually see how adding the government and adding the insurance company can complicate the markets very quickly, because now the relationship is not only two-way from the buyer to sellers, but also at the same time it involves with the governments because they provide the public insurance plans, and also the government taking the rule to regulate the insurance markets, and also the government has to regulate the pharmaceutical company or maybe the healthcare producer markets. On the other hand, the buyers, the patients itself, now they have to deal with not only the doctors, the drugs company, but also at the same time they have to deal with the insurance company. They have to figure out what kind of insurance package they should buy or purchase in order to get the maximum utility or maximum contract in order to maximize their incomes in general. And also the relationship between insurance company and the pharmaceutical company becomes very, very complex too. As long as there is money involved, it makes things very, very complex. So we are not going to go into the detail. This is just a brief summary of how those agencies react differently according to the rules in the markets. Well, of course, in this chapter, we would like to mainly focus on talking about the pharmaceutical company and what kind of problems they face usually in the markets, and why the pharmaceutical companies, sometimes we thought that they are the big giants, money magnets, but in fact, they are very vulnerable to fail. So let's talk about the life cycle of drugs. So how does a company actually come up with a new product or a new drugs in the markets? So first of all, the company, they have to find some chemical compounds that might actually useful to treat some of the diseases in the markets, because, well, finding some chemical, it's not going to do anything with the disease. Obviously, those are not very useful to treat the disease in the markets. So in order for the company to earn profits, of course, they have to find something that it's useful to treat those diseases in the markets. And then once they found these chemical compounds, they have to test it on the animals. So this is basically an animal trials stage to tell whether the chemical compounds, they are toxic or not. Well, once they pass the animal trials, they are going to put it on a human trials. Well, in this stage, they are going to divide this human stage into 3 different phases. So in phase 1, they're basically going to apply a very, very low dosage to healthy individuals, someone who don't have disease at all. Well, in this phase, basically the purpose of it is to test whether the drugs or maybe the chemical compounds, they are having any very serious side effects to human bodies or not. So that's why they are using healthy individuals to test on these chemicals. In phase two, once it passed phase one, of course, when the drugs does not have a very serious side effects, now they can slowly apply it to the unhealthy individual, which is the people who were designed for these drugs. So people with the disease that they don't want to cure. So a regular dosage will be applied to those unhealthy individuals, and it takes about 2 years' time, just like in phase one. And in phase three, they are going to apply these drugs randomly by selecting random samples in the market, and of course paying people to go into a trials to test the effectiveness of these chemical compounds in preventing the disease or maybe helping on the medical conditions. Usually this phase takes the longest term because it has to apply to the real patients, and also at the same time they have to observe the side effects and also the long-term effects of these chemical compounds on these sick people. So usually it will take up to 3 to 4 years to complete these trials. If everything goes smooth, well, of course, fortunately speaking, then the drugs will get past of all these 3 different phases, and the pharmaceutical company, now they have the data on hand, which is a set of data they will file to the US FDA, which is the Food and Drugs Administration, and the FDA will review those documents and also to review all this testing on human and also animals in order to approve for the drugs to launch in the markets. So approximately having a new drug sent to the markets or launched in the markets, obviously it will take about 10 or more years to get to the point where the drug is finally legally to launch in the markets. So the cost of having a new drug set in the market is not only monetary term, but in this case, you can actually imagine it actually involves with a lot of resources, like getting the patients to join the trials, and also at the same time, the time cost, it's really high for a pharmaceutical company to come up with this one new drugs in the markets. So once the drug actually get approval for sales, well, the drugs company usually will be rewarded by having a patents filed for the products. So this patent, it's basically a temporary legal monopoly protections file for the company in order for the company to guarantee or maybe to have a secure income or profits in order to pay off what they have invested in the past. So this patent usually, well, in the US, in the case of US, it lasts for about 17 years to sell the drugs in the market solely by this one company. So this is a company chance to basically to recover or maybe to recoup the millions of dollars spent on testing on the new drugs. And after the time's up, well, then other companies in the markets, now they can actually produce the same drugs cheaply, and also the profits for the drugs will sharply decrease in the market because, well, of the competitions involved. So basically the idea is once company A invented this new drug, spent 10 years of it, and for the first 17 years, company A can sell this drug solely in the market. So no one can ever sell this same drugs or similar drugs in the markets because of the protections of patents. And once the 17 years patent license, it's up for the time, other company like company B can actually comes in and say, well, you know what, we see the patent has passed, so I would like to produce this drug exactly the same way as the original company produced. So those company producing the drugs that it's not originally designed by this company, it's usually what we call the generic drugs. So the generics, but basically is the drugs that actually produced by a company that it's not originally designed the drugs for. So the drug developments become very complex because obviously if monopoly power is not given for the pharmaceutical company, well, not many company would like to invest on this new drug. So that means basically you can actually imagine if no one want to invest money to the new drugs, well, the problem is we will never have uh, new drugs to treat the disease that we have nowadays. So talk about the drug development. It's quite important in the study of pharmaceutical industry. So in general, there are some number we can actually take a look here. So developing new drug, it's very costly. In terms of certainty, um, well, having a company devoting millions of dollars and years of testings, um, the drugs usually it's not that easy to pass all these tests and also getting the approval from FDA. So this uncertainty of having these new drugs launch in the market becomes a very big challenge for a pharmaceutical company. So only about 21.5% of the drugs that enter phase 1 will pass to phase 3 in the trials. So that means for 100 new drugs that goes into phase 1, get into the human trials, well, unfortunately, only 21.5%, which means 21.5 new drugs will actually, out of the 100 drugs, will get passed from phase 1 to phase 3. And we're not talking about getting the approval from the FDA in the United States. So the successful rate for this new chemicals compound to get passed through the humans trials, it's very difficult. Not only just that, the whole process actually involved with hundreds of millions of dollars in order to get to the point where the FDA might actually get approval for the drugs to launch. According to Morgan et al. 2011, so the cost for having the drugs to get to the approval stage, usually it will go from $92 million to $883.3 million per one drugs from the year of 1970 to 2000. So within this period, the least expensive drugs that get to the stage where the FDA can finally review the document is $92 million versus the most expensive testing cost or all these different trial costs will go up to $883 million. So this financial cost, it's huge, and the uncertainty for having the chemicals to launch in the market is still very low. Combining the two, obviously, developing new drugs in the markets become very risky decisions for the pharmaceutical company. And that's why patents becomes a very important factors in the pharmaceutical industry. So in general, how are we going to induce company to make this very costly investments to come up with a new drugs? So problem in general are the research and developments are usually very high cost. So the fixed cost in the pharmaceutical industries are relatively large because of all this upfront cost that they have to pay in order to get the new chemical compounds to get to the approval stage. However, the marginal costs for producing the drugs are relatively low. So that means in order for the pharmaceutical company to produce one more pill in the productions, it's very small, tiny. Usually it's just a few cents that the company has to pay for this chemical compounds in order to make this one new pills or produce this one new pill, not coming up with this one new pill. So that means to produce, let's say, the painkiller in the markets, one pill may cost 3 cents. Producing an additional, the marginal cost to produce one more units. So the additional cost to produce the second pill, maybe it's just another few cents. So you can actually think about the marginal cost to produce drugs are relatively low. So how is the combinations of the fixed cost, the large fixed cost and very, very extremely low marginal cost create a problem for a pharmaceutical company? So in general, we can actually think about if one day one company actually spend, let's say, $100 million to come up with these new drugs in the market, and producing these new drugs, it's relatively cheap to do. So this company might actually start producing the drug, but other pharmaceutical company in the markets, they might actually take this one pill home and trying to study this pill and see what other chemical compounds are in this pill, and in order to repeat it. So the pharmaceutical companies are very, very vulnerable to these generic drugs in the markets, because without any protections for this original company to sell their drugs in the markets, well, there will never be a profits guarantee for the company to earn their money back from the investments of the research and development. So patents create a legal monopoly. Sometimes we think of monopoly, it's not a good thing, but in this specific markets, a legal monopoly becomes a central rule for the pharmaceutical company to guarantee their profits to invest on the new drugs. So the opportunity for monopoly to earn profits basically is what driving the pharmaceutical company nowadays to be innovates to create new products to cure the disease that cannot be cured in the past. So in practice, only about 30% of the drugs actually pay for themselves. Only the top 30% of the drugs. So that means for some of the drugs that came into the market, still, even given the monopoly power for the company to sell in the market, still, it's hard to see the 70% of the drugs in the market to make up the investment costs for developing the drugs by itself in the markets. Now the question is, of course, having the patents or giving the rights for the company to sell their own drugs in the markets becomes a incentive for a company to be innovative. However, the question should also be asked, how long should this patents, or how strong is this patent should be given to that company who have these new drugs on hand? Well, this diagram here basically represents how the relationship between the strength of the patents and also the rate of innovations. So this cone-shaped graph actually represents to us, well, if we move on to from one end, let's say a very, very low strain of patents, or even sometimes we can think of if on the extreme, there is no patent rules in the markets, well, no one will never be innovate. No one wants to create new thing because it does not worth to pay $1 million to earn zero economic profits. On the other hand, if we are going to the other extreme to have a very, very strong patent law or regulations in the market, let's say instead of 17 years of patents protections, now the company is given, let's say, forever lifetime of protections for their drugs. Well, because of this extremely strong patent protections, well, the drug company don't needs to invest into any other drugs anymore, because obviously they can actually always sell these drugs on their own in the markets. No one can actually sell the same drugs, so they will be able to earn profits forever. So given this very simple story here, you can actually kind of imagine the downside of a strong patents regulations. It creates a problem in the markets. So the customers will have to pay monopoly price for a very, very long periods, and there will be less incentive for further innovation by the same company, because the company already came up with this very profitable product, so they don't have to come up with a new one either forever. And also the legal barriers becomes the subsequence of innovation by another company too. However, a weak policy, of course, will create a problem. Just like how we say it, the weak policy will give no incentive for a company to come up with new drugs because, well, if with no profits guarantee, well, no company will ever spend even a penny to invest on any new products. So this graph or diagram here basically represents the strength of the patents regulations become very critical to actually increase the level of innovations. And there will always be one particular point on the diagram, which is point A, which maximize the rate of innovations in the markets. Is the 17 years rule actually becomes the maximum strength of patents in the markets? Well, to be honest, this is still a very hypothetical conclusions in this model, but in general, we can actually try to change the law from 17 years to 16, 15, 13. Hypothetically, we can do it until we get to the point A. But in general, we have already seen a huge increase of innovations in the past centuries, specifically in the pharmaceutical industry. So we believe the law is not perfect. Well, there's no one regulation that's perfect, but indeed, we still see a very, very strong growth of innovations in the past century that motivates new drugs company to come up with new products and to be innovative in the markets. So how does the patents regulations difference in the developing country comparing to the developed countries in like in the US or Canada or UK? So in the developing country, usually low incomes populations, it's the majority in the country. Well, because of the low income status, it becomes a very, very difficult law to apply to innovate company to come up with new drugs or new products. First of all, the monopoly price actually weighed more heavily on the low-income populations because, well, with the monopoly price set so high in the market, the low-income population will not even have the money to begin with to get those new drugs. So it becomes a problem, even though the company can come up with this new product in the market, and the company can actually exercise the monopoly power to set these high prices in the market. But no one will be able to afford it. So it becomes a problem that might not be profitable for company to be innovate in those developing countries, even given the protections of patents. Also, free rider effects becomes a significant effect. So let's say if the US has a patent protections, obviously companies will develop new drugs even if there are weak protections in India, because the fact that they are being protected in the US, and also they will be able to actually invest more money to sell in the US market instead of selling in the developing country like the India. So it becomes a problem of a free rider because those company who invest so much, they would always like to sell their drugs in this very rich developed country instead of the developing countries. And sometimes economists believe, given the market setting or international market setting like this one here, with the developed country, they are willing to pay high price, and also the developing country, they can only afford to pay very, very low price. In theory, the pharmaceutical company, they can actually price discriminate different countries, just like how they discriminate different group of consumers in the market, as you learn in your principal microeconomics. However, the price discriminations might not be ideal in the markets to have the monopoly firm to maximize the profits in such a way. But in the discussions of pharmaceutical company in general, in terms of international scales, we think it actually a good thing because even with higher level of profits earned by this monopoly firm internationally, um, but given more people will have a chance to get the new drugs to get cure from the drugs. It's actually a good thing because saving life is more important than actually having to care about company earning money. So price discrimination is another way most economists think that, well, maybe this is the route where the drug company might actually maximize the profits in order to provide more drugs or different new drugs to the international markets. However, there is a very, very important issue for price discriminations. It's almost not feasible for a company to charge one price in the US and also charge another price for the same drugs in India, for saying. Because of number one, the black markets always exist. So this black markets might actually create this price leaking internationally. So what does it mean by price leaking? So for example, if you live in the US and you're trying to buy this cancer drugs in the markets, you might have to pay, let's say, $1,000 pill in the United States. However, the company was exercising price discriminations and charging only $20 in India, but $1,000 in United States. I think it makes sense for some people realize that, well, they can actually get the exact same drugs from India for $20 and actually ship it or maybe even bring it to you in the US and sell it to you for, let's say, $500. And you still save a lot of money from these transactions. So this black markets running behind might actually create what we call an arbitrage. So arbitrage, basically, it's an opportunity for people to actually earn a profit by buying something somewhere and sell it to somewhere else to earn a profit. So if everyone knows India is a cheaper place to buy, much cheaper place to buy these drugs, well, no one will ever buy the drugs from the US. So this is basically, it's a non-feasible condition to have the price discriminations applied to the international markets. Some of the countries or developing countries, they might actually set at least a price ceiling in the markets in order to promote people or company to be innovate domestically. So a price ceiling, basically, it's a maximum price the supplier of the products can charge in the market. So for example, Italian government actually might put a maximum permissible price for each of the drugs that's available in the market in Italy. And also NHS in UK might set a price at which they are willing to purchase the drugs and exercising what we call the monopoly power, since they becomes one particular buyers of the drugs in the market. So it becomes a connective powers for them to negotiate with the drug company. So this price ceiling is actually a possible action taken by the government in order to control the inflated price or monopoly price in the markets in order to reduce or lower the cost for patients in the markets. However, this regulations or price control becomes a very important factor that reduce innovative or incentive for research. So there's always a trade-off. When you're taking one actions by the government, there will be another negative things could happen. So in this case, setting a price ceilings or maybe having a price control in the pharmaceutical markets, it will actually reduce the level of profits for those pharmaceutical company, and at the same time, it might actually reduce the innovations or incentive to be innovates in the markets. Versus if we are going to take a look at the U.S. markets, well, U.S. market usually have very easy or free price system in the pharmaceutical markets. So there will be not much of a price regulations or price controls that apply to any drugs in the markets. So it becomes a very welcoming place for pharmaceutical company to start their research in the United States, because they know it's once they comes into the United States to invest money to create these new drugs, well, they will have all the freedom to sell the price that makes sense for them to make up for the costs from the investments. So other countries might actually take advantage of this and taking a free ride from this U.S. markets, because, well, they might actually have company set up the base in the U.S. in order to have or enjoy those profits that could possibly earn in the U.S. markets. So to compare different countries' policy, now it becomes significant, because once we know how pharmaceutical company works, for company who has base in Italy, for saying, since they know they will always be restricted with the price they can charge in the markets by the governments, well, they may actually take advantage to have the research done in the US so that they can actually sell their drug in the US for much higher profits comparing to the development in Italy. But at the same time, those research or development results might actually benefits locally in Italy, because those companies might use those knowledge and bring back those new drugs or new patent drugs back to their own country and sell on their own, and benefits the populations in Italy. So this basically have two effects. With this free pricing system in the US, of course, it will benefit the markets to have more and more new drugs come in every year. But the cost for this free price controlled market is that the people in the US, they have to suffer with much higher prices they have to pay for the drugs, comparing to other price control country like Italy or UK. Well, those countries will take advantage of the US, and they will have the company develop these new drugs in the US and sell at a high price. And also at the same time, they will not have to devote too much of their resources in UK or Italy to actually bring back those drugs from the US and sell at an even much lower price or regulated price. So in general, price control become a very significant topics to talk about in the case of this international drug markets. So at the end of the day, of course, we might actually want to understand how innovations it's being created. There is one specific study of induced innovation, which help us to understand how much we have or how this innovation has become popular in the world. So the definitions of induced innovations, basically it's a discoveries that result when innovator change the research agenda in response to profit opportunity. So basically the definition saying that induced innovations explain how does the pharmaceutical company might actually change the research agenda according to the change of the markets. So if they see different demographic change in the market, they will respond to it and to shift the focus of the drugs to other areas, or maybe other types of diseases, or maybe other uses in the market. So one example that actually become evidence of this induced innovation is the change of the demographics. So as in the United States, the population age between 1970 to 2000s actually has grown by a lot because of the baby boomers in the early 19th century. So people become older and older and older, but not many people are actually getting born after that baby boom. So the drug company now, they look at the market and they may actually find this opportunity to earn a profits, because nowadays they should not actually focus on selling drugs to the young populations. Instead, they know it. Well, most of the people who will be buying the drugs are the elderly. So it becomes very popular after the 1970s. Drug companies, most of the big giant drugs company, they actually changed the research agenda to turn their attention to the drugs for elderly instead of the younger populations. Also, academics and public institutions might actually engage in induced innovations, but in this case, they are not responding to the possibilities of the drugs, but indeed, sometimes they might actually focus on this innovation because maybe they're just interested into the topics of this new disease, or maybe for some people out there, they might, for some nonprofit institutions out there, the interest is to save people. As long as they can come up with these new drugs that can save a lot of people, well, that's the objective of those institutions, to focus on innovations. So, for example, there's a large scale of productions of penicillins during the World War II by the U.S. Departments of Agriculture. So this is basically a use during the World War II to save life. The purpose of this drugs, it's not actually driven by profits. It's basically driven by saving life. And in the recent years, some academic researchers have focused more on obesity because, well, it becomes very important issue to solve in the United States. So the problem of obesity is growing every single year. People are getting more and more problems from obesity. So the academic researchers starts to focus more, or putting more innovations on these resolving these problems in the market. So under the market settings of induced innovation, so obviously there are some people, or maybe there are some group of people in the market might get hurt, or may not be benefits by these innovations of drugs in the markets. So for example, disease that it's rarely happens in the population. So for example, disease that hardly can be found in the market, but it's very difficult to treat, or maybe there are some disease that only happens in the developing country where people again don't have the wealth to pay for those vaccinations, or maybe treatments for the disease. Those are the people basically don't get the benefits from induced innovation, because, well, those are the area where profits it's hardly can be found. So in this case, well, the governments in this situation will have to step up to motivate people to actually fight for those disease, by maybe giving fundings to academics research, or maybe providing some kinds of financial motivations for private company to come up with a vaccinations to treat those disease, or preventive tools for those disease in the developing countries. So some of this action taken by the governments before in the US include one of the acts is called the Orphan Drugs Act. Basically, it's a act that comes in to fix the problems for low investments on where happen disease. So some of those disease happens in the United States. Maybe we will find 100 cases in a year where a new drugs comes in might not be profitable because not many people are actually consuming those drugs. So the Orphan Drugs Act actually improved the situation by funding the research institution to come up with solutions, or maybe new drugs to treat those rarely happens disease. Another way to motivate innovation is by direct purchase. So some of the vaccinations, or maybe there are some of the disease that more happens to the developing country, well, in order to prevent those happens, well, sometimes government might step in to fund those programs in order to provide financial motivation for a company to be innovate. So we have touched base on how governments actually involved in the pharmaceutical industry. Now it's time to actually take a look at the regulations of pharmaceutical industry in general. So before the 1930s, there are not much of a regulations on drugs in the United States nor in the rest of the world. However, some event actually happens in the early 1960s that actually shape the uh, pharmaceutical industries from an unregulated industry to a highly strictly regulated industry. So in the early 1960s, what happened is there is a outbreak of what we call the pharmacopoeia in Germany. There is a bunch of dozens of cases actually outbreak in the Western Europe. Basically, it's Phocomania. Basically, it's underdeveloped limbs in the newborn, so it's a disorder of the newborn child. So the doctors at the times in Europe, they are trying to figure out, well, why babies were having this disorder, but couldn't find the reasons. And later in the November of 1961, actually a group of doctors, they have been observing, well, what are the comments of these pregnant women before they giving birth. They actually found that most of the pregnant women who had the morning sickness or suffering with the morning sickness, they were taking one of the most common pills at the time, which is the pill, the drug's name is called thalidomide. So the thalidomide, it's basically it's a drug that usually combat the insomnia and also nausea. And also, it's very often given to pregnant women who suffer the morning sickness. So, phenodimer, it's basically it's one of the common drugs most of the pregnant women giving birth to this disordered babies who were at the time. Um, at the However, this is just speculations. Well, no one actually um, believe that the drugs actually causing this disorder of the newborn baby. However, later in the same years, more and more newborn baby found the same disorder. And at the end of this case, finally, we found about more than 10,000 newborns baby, and most of them are in Germany that actually associate with these drugs that usually the pregnant women took to fight for those morning sickness problem. Well, finally, the result is, of course, all this thalidomide actually putting off the shelves. They are prohibited to sell in the markets. And also, after that, in Germany and also across Europe, more and more stricter drug regulations has been implanted to the markets. Well, in the U.S., actually, one of the senators in the U.S., his name is Cavalvold. He actually trying to persuade the Congress to act on this fact that happens in Germany. So in 1962, the Cavova Harris Amendment actually implements into the markets, which putting a lot more stricter drug regulations into the U.S. markets. So the FDA will finally given the power to actually observe and also approve for new drugs to be sent to the markets. Well, these regulations, of course, it reduce the number of new chemicals and entities in the markets significantly because, well, putting all these new strict restrictions to the market, that means, well, the company now have to pay much higher costs to get past of those trials testing, and also at the same time, it will take much longer time to test for the safety of the drugs. Well, one of the most controversial topics in the case of FDA regulations, or maybe either to pass or not passing the drugs to the markets, it's that whether we are passing a bad drug or maybe not passing the good drugs, it involves error. So those error in statistics we usually putting into terms, which is what we call the type 1 error and type 2 error. So type 1 error, basically it's a false positive decisions, and a type 2 error basically is a false negative decisions. So for example, when the FDA is passing a bad drugs into the market, so unsafe drugs into the market, well, that basically is what we call the type 1 error. So bad drugs getting the approved, it's a type 1 error in the market. On the other hand, a type 2 error is when FDA rejecting or delaying a good drugs to launch in the markets. So in this case, basically, it's a good thing that people cannot get because it got rejected or maybe delayed by the FDA. So you can now kind of see the FDA is standing into a positions where they are facing both error that could possibly happen. A stricter FDA regulations will promote a lot of the type 2 error, but a performative regulations, however, on the other hand, might actually promote another types of errors in the markets. So phase 3 trials do not actually have the complete information about the drug. So from time to time, the FDA have to make a decisions whether they are having enough evidence to provide for the approvals of the new drugs or the new chemical entities to the markets. So some errors are basically inevitable in the market because the process of distinguishing between the good and bad drugs are basically imperfect. And the FDA and other modern regulators agency relied on the result of clinical trials to decide which drugs should get approved. And data from this 3 phases that we have studied, of course, it becomes very, very important. Even though it's imperfect, but still, it's a very, very important piece of information. So the test is not perfect, of course, but the distributions sometimes might actually tell us, well, which side of the error should we actually balance more. Well, since none of this information can be perfectly illustrate whether the drug is safe or good or bad, ideally, of course, any regulators or drugs regulators out there, they should actually trying to minimize the combinations of both errors in the decisions makings in order to maximize the social welfare. However, unfortunately, most of the time the regulator, they care about more of the type 1 error rather than the type 2 error. So that means they are willing to actually sacrifice a lot of the type 2 error, so they don't mind to increase the level of type 2 error in order to minimize the type 1 error. Well, the fact is, to be honest, well, no politicians would like to take the risk to actually approve for a bad drugs into the markets that cost someone's life or maybe making a very, very bad media attentions that actually might affect the futures of the job security. So type 2 error, it's very difficult to be identified. So sometimes FDA, they reject those good drugs. Maybe no one's have ever known because it has never been applied to anybody in the market. So no one would ever find out whether the FDA is rejecting the good drug for good reasons or not. So in this case, of course, FDA or any health regulator, they will rather minimize type 1 error and maybe putting a much stricter rule to increase the level of type 2 error. So that's one of the concerns in the pharmaceutical industry, that we might not actually get enough good drugs to send to the markets because of the politicians' concerns of the imitations to the public. There are other types of regulations that we can also talk about, such as in the US, it's very common. You have to have a doctor prescriptions in order to get the drugs. This prescription power given to the doctor has its own benefits and costs. So in most cases, of course, the benefit is there will be less intentional and unintentional abuse of the drugs. So it will be safe for the doctor to prescribe the drugs directly to the patient so that they can apply the knowledge to tell the patients whether the drug is needed for them or not, rather than the patients will get the drugs on their own and do their own research. Right? On the other hand, the cost for having this prescription power only designated to the doctor is time. So it's very, very time costly. So every time the patient has to see the doctors on a Saturday, Sunday, maybe if they cannot see their personal doctors, well, that means they have to wait another 2-3 days before they can get the drugs that they needed. It's very inconvenient. It's very expensive too. It increased the transaction cost. It increased the time cost for the patients. So any regulations has its own benefits and costs. Well, sometimes we have to balance both. And in the next couple of chapters, we are going to talk about the evaluations of these costs and benefits. On the other hand, there are other regulations also. It's straight in the US, but not too much for the outside world. For example, in the country like UK or Canada, the direct-to-customer advertising, it's banned everywhere in the country, in those countries. So that means the drugs company, the pharmaceutical company, it's banned to make public advertisements for the product in the country. On the other hand, in the US, we have a relatively relaxed regulations on these types of strategies of the pharmaceutical company. So ban in advertisement, it's rarely happens in the US. However, there are still some very important rules the pharmaceutical company has to follow, such as there are some warning statements that they have to put on their advertisement, or maybe there are some sort of informations that they have to provide before they actually get approval of the advertisements. Again, having a stricter restrictions on direct-to-customers advertisements and the cost of it as the follows. So the benefits to have a more relaxed regulations is to prevent, or maybe a stricter regulations is to prevent moral hazards. All right. So in general, we don't want the patients to actually take this moral hazard level higher. So we don't want to give the patients more and more information so that they can actually request more and more unnecessary drugs expenses or maybe medical expenses on treatings on their disease or maybe illness. Providing those advertisements will definitely induce the demand of these drugs. However, the cost for having a stricter advertisement rule is consumer may not find out about the new drugs at all, right? So there might be some drugs, if people actually watch it on advertisements, they might actually find out, oh, this is a drug that can cure for what I have right now. They can actually consult their doctors. They can actually find out what are the benefits for taking those drugs. And it's easier to pass on the information in this way. Without advertisement, it will become very difficult because now patient is not giving those public informations, and every time they are basically depending on solely on the advice of the doctors or maybe the physicians at the visits of the hospital or maybe the clinics. So again, well, benefits and costs involved in both all the regulations that apply to the pharmaceutical industry. But one thing worth to note is any regulations will have its own cost. So there's no one regulation that's perfect for everyone. There will always be a cost and benefits involved. So finally, to conclude the chapters, we would like to actually take a look of the trade-offs between different topics that we have discussed. Because this chapter, it's basically mainly talk about the pharmaceutical company, the pharmaceuticals industries, and what are the trade-offs they are facing. Why is it so difficult for them to run their businesses, even though in today's days we see all these pharmaceutical companies earning very attractable profits, but still, don't forget they are at the same time facing a very high risk for investing those new drugs in the markets. Number one, by putting the patents rules to given the rights for a company to solely selling the products or drugs in the markets, it provides incentive for increasing the level of innovations in the markets. However, the trade-off for having these patents is taking out the affordabilities of the prescription drugs. So for example, we talk about the stricter the patent it is, the longer terms we give into the pharmaceutical company. That means, well, the drug price will never fall. So it becomes very unaffordable for people to buy drugs. However, if we putting very little of the patents periods for the company to sell the drugs, well, it will reduce the incentive for innovations. Price controls policy also has its trade-off. So with much lower price ceiling or maybe a stronger price control policy in the country, it takes out the innovations initiative. So that means company living having their company set up in the country where the price price restriction is very high, they cannot sell their drugs at a high price. That means there's no profits to incentivize the investments on innovations. On the other hand, well, affordability will increase for the citizens living in the country because, well, drugs now it's being controlled by the country and it becomes very affordable for citizens to enjoy those drugs. But again, it kills off all this pharmaceutical company in the long runs if a strong price restrictions is being applied. FDA regulations. So stricter regulations, again, much harder to pass the drugs. That means it's getting more and more drugs to get rejected. So even sometimes the new drugs will get rejected too. But on the other hand, we having a very relaxing regulations or maybe very loose regulations by the FDA. That means, well, there will be more dangerous drugs to be available in the markets. So again, it's a trade-off of new drugs or fewer dangerous drugs in the markets. Type 1, Type 2 error, again, it's basically related to the FDA regulations. So approving of bad drugs versus declining the good drugs, those are the decisions the FDA or any pharmaceutical regulator, they have to make the decisions on. Doctor prescriptions also become very controversial because again, with the prescriptions, that means it's safer to use the drug because it's being monitored by the doctor, it's advised by the doctors, so the doctors knows whether the drugs fits you or not. However, if we take out the doctor prescriptions, on the other hand, well, things will get cheaper, there will be people using less times, so overall, it's easier to get to the drugs that they needed, but it increase the level of risk for people taking without the monitors of the doctors or physicians. So in general, the pharmaceutical company has a lot of issues go on, and it's hardly to have just one very simple regulations to be able to regulate the markets. It has to change from time to time. It has to update from time to time. It's very difficult to have a regulations body where they will stick with just one agendas in order to keep everything affordable. Sometimes we have to consider the innovation part of the markets. So in the US, it's somehow very open and free for a company to actually be innovate and charge the price in order to make up the cost. However, on the other hand, we see the problem in the United States is we're seeing the medical bills going higher and higher every single year. So we will leave the topics to discuss for the technological change for the next chapters. So in this chapters, again, well, there are a lot of readings for you to read, and I believe those reading will actually incentivize you to discover more about this pharmaceutical industry in general. So I will see you next time.